Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in good spirits and safe and healthy wherever you are in the world. And I'd like to say that today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to share with you some final thoughts with respect to the series of videos that I have had the great honor and pleasure of being able to do on this channel with respect to the one, the only, John Carpenter, one of the great artists of cinema. And I'd like also to share with you my own personal ranking of the films directed by John Carpenter. I have had the great honor and privilege and pleasure to have been able to go through each of the films or works directed by John Carpenter, starting with the film Dark Star and going all the way through to the film The Ward. Now, I must say at the outset that I did not go through anything with respect to the films that he is credited as having written the script or a certain version of the script or the story or whatever, or other kind of non-director credit. And so as a result, in my journey through the works of John Carpenter, I did not, for example, touch upon any of his other the other films that are associated with him, not necessarily via a directing credit, but via other types of credits. So, for instance, Halloween 2 or Halloween 3 or The Eyes of Laura Mars, etc. And so I didn't necessarily have the opportunity to go through those during this series. I focused in on the films that were directed by him. And also I did not necessarily talk about his early short films prior to Dark Star and Assault on Precinct 13. And so this journey really, for me, in terms of the context of this YouTube channel, started with his first feature film, which was Dark Star, and it carried through to The Ward. And along the way, of course, I decided to cover certain works that he did for television films, and thus I also decided to include certain episodes that he did for example, Masters of Horror. But for the most part, these are feature-length films that he directed. And so I've had the great honor and pleasure to go through those one at a time and just talk about them to the best of my ability. And I think that in just as a kind of summation, based on my own personal experience with John Carpenter's works, I find that the more my mind and my heart are occupied with the artistic craft of the works of John Carpenter, the more I realize that his works are quite profound and quite deep, and they go at the very sort of heart of real effective cinema that is very much related to not only different kinds of genre and how the genres operate respectively, but also how John Carpenter really truly is an artist of the cinema that loves the craft but also loves the history of cinema. And we've seen time and time again just how much his films tie in so closely to what I like to describe as being classical cinematic traditions, a cinema of the past. And so in many ways his films were almost like a cinema of the past but also cinema of the present and the future. and all at the same time dealing with genre entertainment, but also dealing with very prevalent themes and very pressing situations and issues that I think are even now very, very relevant. And so this is all to say that John Carpenter as an artist of cinema is a true master, almost one-of-a-kind artistic maverick in the sense, and also one whose work never fails to entertain and never fails to provoke thought. And I think that is something that we are very fortunate to come to expect from the great masters of cinema. John Carpenter, I think, can be considered being one of those. And so it has been my great pleasure to go through the works of John Carpenter, the directed works by John Carpenter, one work at a time on this channel. Again, it's not perfect. My conversations and comments I don't think were as complete as I would have liked them to be, but I did my very best. And so with that, today, this is my final video, at least for the time being anyway, on the works of John Carpenter. And as I do with many of these other sorts of series, I suppose, that I am very fortunate to be able to do on this channel, I'd like to end with a ranking, a personal ranking list of the works directed by John Carpenter. These are all the films, or in some cases TV episodes, that I discussed all the way since September 2019. And so I've decided to rank them in my own personal ranking of my own personal favorites. Now, I am I'm almost positive that my list that I'm about to share with you will likely not match your own. And I know that there are many John Carpenter fans out there, and I've seen many top 10 John Carpenter films, lists, etc. And I'm always amazed at how varied they are. And how people can have different takes on the same works and have them fall in different places on their own favorites lists. I completely get that. And of course, it's not just the case for John Carpenter films, but for many other filmmakers as well. So this is to say that I'm pretty positive that my list will not necessarily match yours. And so if you have your own favorites list, what are your favorite John Carpenter films? If you have a ranked list of your favorites in order of preference, then please, of course, feel free to share them, your list, in the comment section below at any time, my friends. I'm always interested to hear what it is you have to say in your own ranked list. I think this is something that is very, very interesting. And I should say also, before I go into this, is that this is a very difficult list for me to compile. I find that ranking lists and favorites lists are things that I think are, for me anyway, very difficult, because I tend to change my mind a lot. And so the list that I have for you today might not necessarily be the exact same list that I would come up with if you asked me the same question tomorrow or the day after, because this is to say that I think for me this can all change, and I'm very much still thinking. Even now I wonder if the list is complete, or maybe I should change a certain order here and there. But this is all to say that I could always change my mind, but this is how I feel at this particular moment in time. It's now about May 2020. And I should also say that I decided to include the Masters of Horror episodes in their own individual positions on the list. And so because I discussed each of them separately in their videos on this particular channel, so I decided to do that. And I won't include any scripts or any short films that he did prior to Dark Star, for instance. And so it's not a wholly complete John Carpenter list, of course, but let's just take it as a list of films directed by John Carpenter, or in the case of Masters of Horror, episodes directed by John Carpenter. And so with that, my friends, without further ado, here is my list of my favorite John Carpenter films from number 23 all the way to the top, number 1. Number 23. And when I mention this title, I should just say also from the outset that when I mention this title at number 23, it might sound like this is a film that I don't like. But in fact, please understand that this film is, in my opinion, not a failure. I think it's actually a very good film, and I said as much in the individual video that I did. And so it might seem like because it's at the bottom of the list, I hate it or something like that. On the contrary, far from it, my friends. I don't hate it at all. I actually like it, and I admire many things about it. But it just happens to be number 23 because there are 22 other works directed by John Carpenter that I tend to gravitate towards a little bit more. But with that in mind, my friends, this film is at number 23 for me, which is The Ward. John Carpenter's The Ward. Now, as I say, this is a film that I think does have, potentially anyway, a bit of shakiness. It is not wholly, how should I put it? There are elements that could be subject of criticism, that's for sure. But at the same time, there are elements that could be said to be purely at home in the context of John Carpenter's filmography. And there are some really fascinating moments and uses of narrative and approaches to storytelling that I think we haven't seen from John Carpenter in his long career up to this point. And so in that case, in that sense, this film is a very interesting one in the context of his filmography, and is certainly one that should be seen by anyone who is interested in John Carpenter's films. Of course, it's a film that is still perhaps still the subject of some criticism that it received from its initial release, and that's fair. That's completely fair. But as always with this film or any film by John Carpenter, any time is ripe for any kind of reassessment or reappraisal, and I think this film really deserves it. And but it, for me, as I say, it's at number 23, but that doesn't mean I dislike the film. I do like it, and I admire what it is that it's trying to do in the context of John Carpenter's filmography. So this is The Ward. Next, this is the film, which is the TV movie called Someone's Watching Me. And this is at number 22. Now, again, it seems perhaps that because I put it on the list at number 22, towards the bottom of this list, this might seem like I dislike the film. Again, on the contrary, I think this is a very tight, taut suspense thriller that really is effective even now. There are a lot of set pieces that really work. The main character, Lauren Hutton's character, is a very likable character, and there are some interesting twists and turns, and even twists upon twists and red herring upon red herring that still keeps one guessing if you are watching it for the first time. So there are a lot of fascinating aspects to this film, and we see John Carpenter working with the TV movie genre, but also the suspense film genre, and that will of course serve him very well after this particular film throughout his career. Again, it might seem like it's low on the list, but that doesn't mean I dislike it. On the contrary, my friends, I really enjoy and like this film. It's still very suspenseful, still somewhat scary in some places, and still holds a lot of surprises. This is the TV film Someone's Watching Me. Next, this is number 21. This is the film Vampires. Now, once again, because this is relatively low on the list, it might seem like I dislike the film, but on the contrary, I do admire this film. I think it is a very fresh, very volatile, quite brutal work, and it does have a number of shocks and scares, quite a bit of shocks in fact, and it is a film that uses the special effects element to great effect, and there are a lot of quite disgusting moments in the film, and there are a lot of challenging moments too, but there are also a lot of almost a a kind of experimental edge to the piece, but at the same time there is also a treatment of the work that gives the film a Western edge to it. And I think that is at the heart and core of what makes John Carpenter's films really great. You know, he can merge different types of genres together to create something that feels fresh and new and wholly of a new cloth. And so I feel this way about the film Vampires. Again, it is a rough world that is being presented here, and it is, in many respects, a kind of dark world, but this is also in keeping with a kind of really almost clever brand of nihilistic entertainment, let me put it that way. That is a thinking person's nihilistic entertainment that I think is at the heart of John Carpenter's films, Vampires included. And so I have put this film at number 21. That is the film Vampires. Next, this is number 20, and this is the film Memoirs of an Invisible Man. And I find this film to be a kind of almost Hitchcockian adventure that is patterned on a film noir element, but also has, I think, a very surprising, quiet, romantic tone that really provides a lovely emotional center to the film and an emotional anchor that grounds the film. In other words, it's a great special effects spectacle, but it also has a lovely human relationship at its core and a real examination of loneliness and of certain physics and physical complications with respect to this particular special effects element that is at the centerpiece of the film, namely the state of being invisible. And so I think there are a lot of really interesting, charged and charming things at play here. And so I really find this both an entertaining ride, a thrill ride that is also quite emotionally moving in places. And I find this combination to be very charming and filled with a lot of wit and a lot of sensitivity. So this is number 20, Memoirs of an Invisible Man. Number 19, and this is the film Ghosts of Mars. Now, this is coming in the later part of John Carpenter's filmography, so in the 2000s, and so it might feel to be a film that is maybe borrowing heavily from earlier John Carpenter works, but I tried to suggest that while there are some things that remind us of earlier John Carpenter films, there are some other things that are very fresh and new and original and almost experimental in the context of John Carpenter's filmography. And this is, I think, a very taut and earnestly told entertainment. It's quite surprisingly violent in a lot of places, and it goes in certain ways that I think are not necessarily expected, but I think that's a very good thing. And it still remains, I think, a very entertaining, quite thrilling ride with a lot of very memorable characters at its core. And so I think overall it is a film that is certainly worthy of being part of the John Carpenter filmography. And it's certainly worth checking out, especially, as I say, if you like the edge and the familiarity of earlier John Carpenter films, but are also looking for a fresh spin and an interesting visual style and a certain way of presenting the story that might feel new and different in the world of John Carpenter. So there is a lot of great things going on at the same time in this very entertaining sci-fi film, Ghosts of Mars. Number 18. This is the anthology work, Body Bags. And I should just acknowledge, of course, that we have this anthology work, and so not all of the works here are directed by John Carpenter. Right? So the final anthology segment, is directed by Tobe Hooper. But we can, I think, consider this as a John Carpenter work, because John Carpenter did have a hand in directing a portion of this anthology work, and so and I look at it also in the context of the overall work itself, and so please allow me to include it as part of the ranking here of the works of John Carpenter. And with that, we do have a wonderful blend of action, suspense, horror, and comedy, a very dark comedy, and a lot of wit and dry humor, and a very interesting, well-staged special effects, and a lot of surprises too, and a lot of humor. I mentioned the comedy, of course, but there's a great deal of humor, and at the center of this, perhaps, is the fact that John Carpenter is giving us a really memorable performance. I mean, a really memorable one. And so we not only get his directorial efforts here, but we also get his acting efforts, which I think are certainly quite unique, and have great timing, and really show that John Carpenter is a man of many talents. And not to mention the fact that this is, again, a wonderful example of the horror anthology from the minds of John Carpenter and Tobe Hooper. So it's nice to see their work again. And so in the context of this particular ranking, and with respect to John Carpenter, this is Body Bags. Next is number 17, and this is the Masters of Horror series episode, Cigarette Burns. Cigarette Burns. Now, Cigarette Burns is a very interesting and violent work, but it's also a work that is dialogue driven, and there's a mystery element, or an almost detective film noir element to the film. To the work. And so there are, I think, a lot of great things going on. There are a lot of quite disgusting things as well, and so in many ways this could be seen as almost a new direction for John Carpenter. But also the series, as some of you know, did give a lot of filmmakers a lot of freedom to work within the genre and really push the envelope in many respects, because it was, I think, for lack of a better phrase, it was a way for them to express themselves during this time in the industry, which was the mid-2000s. And so I think on that score alone, we look at Cigarette Burns and we see a work that is from the mind of John Carpenter, that is directed by John Carpenter, that is really pushing the envelope in terms of on-screen violence, but also trying to give us a story that is trying to challenge us in terms of reality and fiction, and also give us great over-the-top acting moments from the actors, for the purpose of giving us a sense of unease and confusion, and maybe not being sure of where we are and our surroundings, which I think is really perfect and ideal when we think of the context of the entirety of the great filmography of John Carpenter. So this is the episode from Masters of Horror called Cigarette Burns. Next is number 16, and this is John Carpenter's film of Village of the Damned. There is a real dark, cold, sinister quality to this film on the one hand that is at the same time tempered really nicely by the almost passionate way that some of the performances, and in particular by Christopher Reeve, just give way to a real sense of unyielding, unnerving tension, which is helped along the way, of course, by the way in which the violence both on screen and implied. The way it is handled in terms of almost expert timing and real sheer precision. And I think this is a lot to do with how John Carpenter is giving us information, and also how John Carpenter is withholding information, but also how John Carpenter knows how to apply the pressure, when to apply the scares, when to increase the tension, and when to give us some flourishes, but also some quiet character time. And all this stuff against the context of this, what is in essence a really dark and quite nasty sci-fi horror film that has a real sinister edge to it. And so it is, again, a film that's certainly not for everyone. I know that, I understand that, but I do think that its sinister edge combined with its real passionate emotional core make for some really engaging entertainment, but also some engaging thought-provoking work from John Carpenter. So this is the film Village of the Damned. Number 15, this is Masters of Horror, the episode that he directed called Pro-Life. And I mentioned it in the video, but I'll mention it here again in brief, that Pro-Life is a very challenging and difficult episode. It is one that has so much tension at its core. It is incredibly tense. There is a kind of inexorable, unyielding sense of horror and disgust, and also suspense, not only in terms of its subject matter, but also in terms of its the way it's trying to deal with certain quite controversial social issues. And this makes this film a very brutal, brutish, and also very, very tense work. This is one of the most tense or quite scary episodes from the series that I've seen, and it also gives me a lot of just trepidation. And every time I see it, I almost recoil in disgust and horror. But I think that's part of the point, and that adds to the real sinister edge that John Carpenter is presenting to us through this quite challenging work that I think represents, in many aspects, John Carpenter doing a lot of new and challenging and interesting things with his craft. So this is Masters of Horror episode entitled Pro-Life. Next, this is number 14. This is the film In the Mouth of Madness. And this is one of those wonderfully, beautifully constructed, confusing films. Every time I see this film, I think I know what's going on, but then I don't quite know what's going on. And then even when I think I know what's going on, I'm still lost. And I think I love the film for that. There is a real a charged element to this. There is a sense of it being a labyrinthine maze in terms of how to keep track of where one is in reality and where one is outside the realm of reality, and where does the line where is the line drawn, and is the line being blurred, and how that is a wonderfully apt metaphor in cinematic expression of the portrayal of the human psyche, and the way that we have externalities and internalities, or internal forces and external forces colliding to create this swirl of confusion of perception, which boils down ultimately to how we view ourselves and our sort of existential crises that face the characters in this film, and all in the context of a kind of loving homage to H.P. Lovecraft, to Stephen King, to the horror genre, and in a meta way, not only in horror fiction but also in horror cinema, and also in keeping with the wonderfully honest and earnest approach that John Carpenter has, not only to genre cinema but also cinema in general. There's a lot going on here that is utterly fascinating. This is the film In the Mouth of Madness. Next is number 13. This is the film Dark Star. Dark Star is one of those films that is just almost in a very interesting way a film that almost it almost defies belief, because it has it has so many different poles of tension and comedy, and also a science fiction bent that is also almost a real low budget affair. And I mean low budget as in a very low budget independent filmmaking, almost guerrilla style affair that is also dependent on a certain way of presenting special effects and the like. And there is a cast of characters that I think is very memorable. They have ways in which they can be very endearing, but also they show certain aspects of the solitariness of this life in deep space, and everything that they have to do during this film, it sort of escalates and goes in ways that if you're watching it for the first time, I mean, it's almost impossible to guess. And so I find this film to be still, even now, a film that is utterly charming. It's still very funny, and it has an edge to it that is very effective even now. And so this is the film Dark Star. Number 12. This is the film Starman. Starman is so emotionally engrossing and captivating, and it has a way of hooking you into its narrative, but also into the thrust of the emotional stakes, because it has at its core a very unique love story, and one that builds and it develops, even though it's a kind of love story that we might expect certain things from, but in fact it goes in a very earnest, sincere direction. It is still a science fiction film, of course, but at its heart there is a real, sincere, touching, emotional core that just stays with us as a kind of constant reminder of just how well John Carpenter operates, not only as a genre filmmaker, but also as a filmmaker with a real humanist sensibility about him. And this film, Starman, is a perfect example of the humanist sensibilities in the craft of John Carpenter. What a beautiful film this is, even now, my friends. This is the film Starman. Number 11. This is the really chilling film, The Fog. The Fog is one of those films that I think has so many things going on. It is a film that is almost loaded or front-loaded with different concepts, and it's a miracle just how well they hang together to create a world, a kind of unusual, sinister, supernatural set of unnatural physics that operate and govern this menace and the antagonistic forces that are on display here in The Fog. But also it really gives us a almost feel of homegrown chill, sense of a real horror and disgust that depends on the slow buildup, but also depends on the sharp stings of jump scares and quite quite effective, chilling, bloody special effects. And so there are a lot of different elements and factors at play here. And it's a very, even now, I'm just amazed at how well it hangs together and creates a kind of sense of backstory, but also gives room for character development and the creation of a kind of community that then becomes the subject of this menace that creeps in very slowly, but then suddenly attacks you out of nowhere. And I love that inherent sense of beautiful contradiction, chilling, horrifying contradiction at the heart of this very scary film, The Fog. Next, this is number 10, and this film is Escape from L.A. This is a film that really grew on me over time, and I mentioned that. I mentioned my journey with this film, and now I have come to really, really admire what it is it's trying to do. It is, on the one hand, a sequel, but also it is doing something quite different from its predecessor. And I think those differences and similarities form a wonderful combination. At the heart of this, of course, is the great performance by Kurt Russell as one of the most iconic characters, not only in John Carpenter's canon, but also in action cinema and sci-fi cinema period. That is Snake Plissken. And in this film, he is presented with a number of wildly entertaining scenarios and predicaments that he must try to escape from. And this story therefore becomes our way of entering into the world of Snake Plissken in the context of the almost absurd, surreal landscape that John Carpenter and crew are presenting with this concept of LA in the future. But it is a future that is still filled with a lot of thought, a lot of concern, both social and perhaps even political. And also it is still filled with a sense of deep-rooted concern for certain elements that are issues for the human race. There are certain concerns about government and paranoia, but at the same time it is a film that never fails to entertain, both on a direct action level but also on the level of absurdist, surrealistic, almost parody, which I think makes this film even more intricate and multifaceted, which makes for very entertaining and fascinating viewing indeed. So this is the film Escape from L.A. Number 9. This is the film Christine. Christine is a horror film. Christine is a very uniquely placed horror film. It is also a story of romance. It is a love story. It is a doomed love story, or to put it more specifically, it is a set of doomed love stories that combine against the backdrop of a horror revenge fantasy film. This has a lot of very beautifully constructed contradictions within it, and I mean that in a positive way. There are many things about this film that tend to make one think it will go one way, but then it goes in a different direction. There are many things about this film that make us root for one character, but then we end up rooting for other characters. There are many things about this film that make us maybe sympathize with a certain set of circumstances, only to then recoil in disgust and then go back again. And this kind of recoiling, or this kind of back and forth, is the stuff that great films do. And horror films are no exception to that. And this is, as I say, at its it is a horror film by its marketing nature, of course, but it is ultimately a story about characters and relationships, love stories and stories about needing acceptance and needing guidance and needing companionship. And so with that, there is a kind of in an interesting way, a kind of heart to this film. It is very sinister and quite dark in places, but there is also a kind of heart to this film that really pushes the film forward in shall I say it, in a almost lyrically poetic and beautiful way. Still sometimes very scary, quite unsettling, but at the same time in a way that we now know is a way that we can expect from the world and mind of John Carpenter. This is the film Christine. Number 8. This is the great biopic, television film biopic, Kurt Russell as Elvis. And what we get here is John Carpenter and Kurt Russell and company taking as its subject matter one of those great American icons, or icons of American music, or icons of Americana, and really giving it a loving portrayal, a loving tribute, a real earnest, good faith attempt at telling the story about this particular individual, this particular human being, one of the most famous figures in modern American history and American culture and American music, of course. But it's given a real sense of earnestness and a real sense of down-to-earth liveliness. And it is also guided, of course, by yet another great performance by the great Kurt Russell. There is a real love of American music that we know from John Carpenter. There is a real love of this sort of American society and culture of this time, and rock and roll that we also understand is really part and inherent to the character of John Carpenter, the artist and the individual. And it is also very entertaining, very fun, and also very heartwarming and quite moving in places. And again, guided once again by the great lead performance by Kurt Russell as Elvis. Number 7. This is the film Prince of Darkness. And talk about a film that is seemingly one kind of genre film that goes in completely different directions. This is a film that even now is a film that surprises me, that stuns me in terms of how it defies genre expectations, but also satisfies genre expectations, but in a way one wasn't necessarily expecting. So how about that for a wonderful swirl of an entertainment of many different aspects. This is, again, another wonderful example of John Carpenter and his cinema craft, just firing on all thrusters. Horror, suspense, but also a sense of trying to give us a different side of a story that we might have come to expect from. I mean, this is a haunted house film, but it's presented in a way that is very unique, reliance on science and the science explanation, and also a reliance on traditional suspense horror themes and presentations, but also giving us different ways in which characters are presented in the films. And so we are given a lot of things that we come to expect from this kind of genre, but then a lot of those things are turned on their heads to give something new and fresh, and still something that is quite unnerving, quite disturbing, very disgusting in some places, in a lot of places, in fact. Even now, some of those images are very difficult to shake from my mind. I don't think I ever will. They're quite disturbing. And that's the kind of power that this film holds even now. What a brilliant, powerful, scary film this is, a surprising film. This is the film Prince of Darkness. Number 6. This is the film Assault on Precinct 13. And this is even now one of those sustained suspense action thrillers that has many elements that are easy to understand because we can understand what they seem to represent, and at the same time it still shocks and surprises. Even now, considering that this film was made many, many years ago, even now the fact that it is still shocking, it is still quite disturbing, and it still is very confrontational in the kind of attitude that it has, is just a testament to the real mind-blowingly brilliant craftsmanship of John Carpenter. The fact that this is still resonant even now is just unbelievable. But again, it shows that Carpenter is indeed the master. He is the master cinematic artist, and so he gave us this film early in his career, and it still has a punch and a kick that is felt even now. And it is also a very engaging work. It operates like a Western. It operates like a Howard Hawks film, but it is given, as I say, a real edge, sort of a modern day edge to it. That is, we have many characters that come together, but there is a real ease of entry because of the way that the information is being presented, but also the suspense as it builds and builds and builds and builds to a kind of unbelievably exciting, enthralling, and suspenseful climax. There is so much going on here, both shocking and suspenseful, both intimate and quiet, and also it's one of those supreme examples of a multifaceted entertainment from the mind of John Carpenter. This is the work which is called Assault on Precinct 13. Number 5, and this is They Live. They Live is so, it's so brilliant just how well this film has lasted. And it is a film that is relevant even now, many, many years after the fact, after it was made and first released. This is mind-blowing to me. Just how prescient or relevant this film remains, even now, as a kind of commentary on class and capitalism, and also at the same time a quite a unique sci-fi film that is also an action film, that is also a wrestling film, and to have all these elements come in a kind of quasi-dystopian mix that is stirred in a way that only John Carpenter can do is truly a sight to behold. It really is a sight to behold. There are still even now many things that make one sit up. There are many things that make one turn back. There are many laughs. Oh gosh, this film is still so funny. It has such a great comic edge to it, but it also is a film that is filled to the brim with themes of paranoia, themes of unease, that is ultimately a very existential sort of threat, but is also a science fiction threat as well. And it's an action film, as I say, and it is also a fight film, and it is a buddy film, and it is so much more. It is a Western, it is so much more. This film deserves all the praise that it can get, and as I say, it still operates with a lot of punch and a lot of sting even now, which is one of those great things about John Carpenter's works, how well they last and they build and build and build over time to be almost eternal. That is certainly the case for this film, this brilliantly conceived work, which is called They Live. Number 4, this is the film Halloween. And many things have been said about this film Halloween, and so I don't think I'd be able to add anything new to the conversation. But this is a classic, iconic film, not just in the horror genre, but in cinema, period. This has so many ramifications for the landscape of modern day cinema. It's just a film that created and inspired so many things. But even with all that, it still remains utterly engrossing and captivating and very scary. And its simplicity, I think, makes it even scarier. Just how effective it is, and the timing and the way that the characters are built and how they are developed and how we go from scenario to scenario to scenario. There's a real master class in filmmaking going on here that is that makes its deceptively simple concept even more genius and brilliant. This is a towering achievement, but you didn't need me to tell you that, of course, because you already knew. And this is one of those. This is one of the big films, and the fact that it still has a long-lasting impact, even now, is a credit to just how strong all the elements hung together at this first stage and this early stage in John Carpenter's career, of course. But it was what a statement of cinema to make, and again with relatively simple means, a relatively low budget, but the way in which he is able to utilize these seemingly simple elements to create a real icon of cinema is just a stroke of cinematic genius. This is the film Halloween. Number 3, Escape from New York. One of the most iconic, most important works from the mind of John Carpenter. This is one of the great action pieces, one of the great sci-fi dystopian works set in the near future, with one of the most important, most emblematic, one of the greatest anti-hero heroes in John Carpenter's cinema, Snake Plissken. And in fact, perhaps the label of hero is more appropriate than anti-hero, because Snake Plissken is a hero. He's one of the people that we really root for, because he is fascinating in terms of the mystery behind who he is, but also he is heroic in how he tries to get out of situations, and he is intelligent and he thinks on his feet, especially in this topsy-turvy world that is presented here, where there are shades of nuance, and bad guys seem to be good, but maybe they're bad again, and the good guys, or who we think are the good guys, are not even that. And so all this stuff comes together in this confusing topsy-turvy world, and into the mix is thrown Snake Plissken, sort of our only beacon of a kind of a fascinatingly presented set of strong moral fiber. But that's just one aspect of what makes Snake Plissken such a fascinating, iconic part of John Carpenter's filmography. What an amazing work, and it's still entertaining even to this day. It is so enthralling, quite exciting, very funny, very sad, almost tragic in places, very poignantly sad, very ironic, very cutting edge, very biting, and also very brutal in its honesty, but also very rewarding and satisfying in how it presents certain arcs of plot and character development. All of this comes together, of course, in one of those classic examples of John Carpenter's cinema, just a real tour de force in many senses of that term. This is the film Escape from New York. Number two, and I must admit that these next two films were, for me, very difficult in terms of where I could put them, where I could place them. Number two and number one. I could honestly say that on any given day I could switch the order of these films, but because they are just, I think they're in many ways almost tied for first place, if you know what I mean. They're both equally my favorites. But for purposes of this ranking and where I find myself today, and my own mindset today, again, May 2020, I will have this at number two. But it is a very close one because it is one of the most important works from the 1980s and from the late 20th century, in my opinion. This is one of the great films ever. John Carpenter's The Thing. The Thing is a thing of beauty. This film is so deeply important to the landscape of horror cinema. It is also deeply important to the landscape of 1980s US cinema. It is also fundamentally important to the landscape of late 20th century cinema in general. This film holds up brilliantly. This film deserves all the praise that it can get. This film still shocks. It is absolutely terrifying, and it is still a film that holds up so well. It has aged beautifully and gracefully, and to the point where even now, many, many years after the fact, some of those scenes that we see unfold before our very eyes in this film are still things that I cannot even believe could have ever happened in any film. Defiance of imagination. I'm not sure if even that phrase does it justice. I mean, it is really, truly one of those ultimately brilliant creative works from this particular period in cinema. And we know that there were a lot of issues with production and also post-production and also when it was released and its critical appraisal, but it has grown in stature to the point where it is an undeniable classic that is arguably deserving of being in the pantheon of the greats. This is one of the most important works from John Carpenter. This is one of the most fascinatingly debated works. There's debates even now about what is actually happening in terms of the plot. Who is who? What is what? That is still part of the debate even now. And that is an example, my friends, of just how powerful this film remains. This film is, in many respects, the shining moment in John Carpenter's filmography. And it is a film that is not for the faint of heart. It is certainly a film that it doesn't provide easy answers. But then again, some of the great examples of John Carpenter's filmography were those that challenged the audiences to think outside the box and to try to consider new possibilities and new concepts and the like. And oh gosh, do we get that in this film and then some? We certainly do, my friends, do we not? This is one of those great films. This is John Carpenter's The Thing. And so with that, this means that my number one favorite movie from John Carpenter is this film. Big Trouble in Little China. This is one of my all-time personal favorite films, and so perhaps I am biased when I make this list. But as I say, it was very close in terms of what came before it in the earlier slot, because I respect both films enormously. But they are different films as well in terms of tone and approach and philosophy. But ultimately, where I find myself now, I am looking at this film and I see a film that, in my eyes, presents a world of cinema that is utter perfection and utter delight. It is a world that I can return to time and time and time again. And I feel so happy to be able to say that I can watch this film. I feel so honored to be able to say that I have encountered this film from a young age, and I've still been able to watch this film over the course of many, many years. And I have grown up with this film, and it is a film that still is one that is very important to me for a lot of the reasons that I tried to explain in the videos that I posted. But in essence, my friends, this is a film that is about a lot of different genres, a lot of different modes of entertainment, but it is also a film that has at its core some of the great witty dialogue, some really rip-roaring action set pieces, a really captivating backstory and a narrative about both action and also the supernatural, and it just goes from place to place to place in a breathtaking Howard Hawks speed. And so it reminds us of cinema of the past, but also cinema of the present and the future. And all throughout this this energetic adventure thrill ride, we get one of the most lovable characters from this era of cinema. Not just from John Carpenter films, but just from this era of cinema period. Kurt Russell's Jack Burton, one of the most lovable characters, one of the great creations, so quotable. Almost every line of dialogue from him is like a gem, a cinematic, screenwriting, poetic gem. Everything that he says and does is something that we believe in and we trust in him. And he represents the heart and spirit that is occupying every facet of this film. Of course, it's not just him. There are so many great things about this film that are at play here. The wonderful cast of characters, and also the crew, and every little thing that's playing a part. The special effects here, the music there, and the tones and the light and the flashes and the shadow, and the way that the stunts are performed, and all this wonderful stuff. And so all of it has heart, and perhaps for many people that is perhaps best represented by the spokesman of the film, if you will. That is Kurt Russell's embodiment of one of those great characters in screen history, I would insist. This is the one, the only Jack Burton in this film that still remains a film so deep and so close to my own heart. I feel like a kid again every time I see it, and it always puts a smile on my face, even where I feel low and I feel blue. I might feel a little bit sad for whatever reason in my life. This film never fails to put a smile on my face. And at the end of the day, my friends, ultimately, that is what I'm looking for in great cinema. Something that will put a smile on my face. And so this film is my number one favorite film, directed by John Carpenter. This is Big Trouble in Little China. Okay, my friends, so that is it from me. Once again, I must insist that this was my own personal favorites list, and I also must insist that even those films that appeared on the low end of the list, just because they were on the low end of the list doesn't mean I don't hate those films at all. I do like those films very much. It just so happened that there were some other films that I had to put higher up on the list. But I love all of the films on the list, don't get me wrong. And I should say also that if you asked me the same question a week from now, I know that my list would change. And so this is something that is still in flux. This is something that is subject to change in my own personal heart. And so this is all to say that if you have a list that is different from the one that I've just presented, that is perfectly okay. Please feel free to share it with me and share it with the rest of us in the comments section below. As always, I'd love to hear anytime, my friends, anytime, what it is you have to say about this great, great filmmaker and his films, the one and the only John Carpenter. And I should say, finally, that, of course, now we're not sure if we're ever going to get another John Carpenter directed film again or directed work again. Of course, would I love to see another John Carpenter film, to be able to see the mind and the artistic concerns of John Carpenter? Of course I would. I would love to see another John Carpenter film, and I hope that one day that might happen. And until then, of course, we still have his great filmography to look back on and rely upon, and also to revisit and to re-explore, because as I try to suggest, each film in its own unique personal way is a gem, really is a gem. And this is a rare thing. Of course, for some people, some films might work better than others. I completely get that. But I think also, at the end of the day, we are dealing with a real master of the craft, someone who has given us a consistent body of work that even now is a body of work that entertains and also gives us food for thought. A lot of it, I would insist. This is the mark of a great artist, and so with that, it has been my absolute pleasure to have been able to talk a little bit about these films, one of my heroes of cinema, and one of the filmmakers that I really, really look up to even now. And with great pleasure and with such a feeling of gratitude towards everything that he has given to us in the form of his great cinema. This is the artist, the icon, the one and the only, John Carpenter. Okay, my friends, so that's it from me and this particular run of videos. So thank you so much for your time over the course of these past several months. I could not have done it without you, my friends. As always, your kindness and support and friendship means so much, and I look forward to our continuing conversations in the future. But until then, my friends, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great movies. So until we meet again, thank you very much, and cheers.